Well, welcome back to the second part of Chapter 11. And in Chapter 11, what we've done so far is we've defined what learning is, and we've looked at ways that we can actually measure whether learning has occurred. And so remember, as we define learning, we can only infer learning by what we see in performance. And then we talked about as we observe practice, specifically as we watch performance curves, we can determine whether or not learning has occurred as we watch performance over time. So the second part of the video, we're going to look at the other ways we can assess learning using retention tests, transfer tests, coordination dynamics, and the dual task procedure. So as we move forward, let's look at these other ways besides performance curves to measure learning. A retention test is often used to help us see if learning has occurred. And the idea here is after you practice a skill, you take a period of time off, and then you come back to see if you can replicate that skill. We often do that. You practice a skill in class, and then you come back 2 days later and you see if you can replicate that skill again. That would be a retention test. In the rehab setting, often you do this where you will practice a skill on Monday, and then the patient will come back on Wednesday and you see if in fact they have retained that skill and can reproduce that movement. The problem with retention tests, there is no specific length of interval. It's completely arbitrary, but it is a way we can measure whether learning has taken place. We're trying to see if there's a permanence to the performance after a time off. And again, many of our labs, we do retention tests where you'll do a skill for a certain amount of time. You'll take a 5-10 minute break. Then you come back and see if you can replicate that skill. That would be considered a retention test. Now, transfer tests is the idea that you see how adaptable the skill is. So you learn a skill in one situation, and then you see if you can replicate it in a different situation. So as you look at how to change tests to see if in fact learning has occurred, you see if you can transfer it to a different skill or a different context, a different situation. So for instance, you might be practicing a skill where the therapist is providing augmented feedback over and over and over again. And then you might have the patient try to do the skill again, but this time without any feedback provided by the therapist. That would be an example of a transfer test. You might change the physical environment. An example here is you practice traversing a set of stairs in your clinic, and the patient's pretty good at going up and down those stairs. And then they transfer that to their home, and they have a different set of stairs, a different type of stair, maybe a different surface area of stairs. That would be an example of a transfer test. Or you could change the physical characteristics. Perhaps the player is able to perform the skill when they're by themselves. But when they're in front of others, they might become stressed or too emotionally charged. And so you can change personal characteristics as well as you relate to transfer tests. So the idea of a transfer test is that you're performing the skill that you learned in one setting, one situation, and now you're providing a novel variation of that skill to see if in fact it can be performed in a different situation or setting. So that would be transfer tests. An example here is how might you assess how well a tennis serve is learned using a transfer test? Well, again, typically we practice the tennis serve. But the transfer test would be how well can you serve in a tennis match of doubles. If I am able to serve in the tennis match, then I can say learning has occurred as I transfer from practice to an actual game situation. So think of some ways that you could take a skill in your area and use a transfer test to see if in fact skill has been acquired or not. Another method or way of assessing learning is from coordination dynamics. And it's, again, watching and observing movement coordination characteristics of a skill. You look for stability, you look for transition from one pattern of behavior to another, and you usually use blocks of time to see if you can see improvement and consistency. And here's an example of a coordination dynamic measurement. We have an individual in a motor learning lab trying to do coordinated movements with the right and left hands. Left hand is doing a 60-degree, and the right hand is doing a 90-degree type of movement. And so as we go through time, again, you're looking for improvement and consistency over time to see if learning has occurred. So here's day one on pre-test. And by the end of day one, after 20 trials, you can see there has been some improvement. We are still struggling with consistency, but we have seen some improvement. We come back, and this is the right. You look down. Here's left arm across the Y and left arm across the X axis. So again, post-test, you see again there has definitely been improvement from day one pre-test to day one post-test, and I'm becoming more consistent. Moving on to day two, looks kind of like day one pre-test with just a little more improvement. But as I practice during day two, by the time I get to my post-test, I'm getting very consistent movements with less variability. And then again, day three, not much difference between my post-test 2 and my pre-test 3. And then by the end of day 3, as far as my coordinated movements, I can have pretty good indication of a consistency and a definite improvement from day 1. So that's just an example of how we might measure coordination dynamics as it relates to learning a task. As we look at change in movement coordination, when we look at movement, we know the more proficient you become, you free up your degrees of freedom. Movement becomes more fluid. Again, think of someone who's just learning a skill. They tend to be stiff, awkward. As they learn the skill, they free up those degrees of freedom, become much more fluid. So at the beginning, we call that frozen limb or stiff. We move as one unit. Think of a youngster trying to catch a ball or running versus a skilled performer catching a ball or a skilled runner. So we go from fewer degrees of freedom to more degrees of freedom, the more skilled a person is. So as we become more proficient in a skill, our leg segmentation becomes much more functional. What we'd say unfrozen. We tend to move in a cooperative way, a coordinated way. Again, that would be a visual observation, but you can definitely see a change in motor skill acquisition from a beginner to a novice as you look at movement coordination as relates to degrees of freedom. When we talk about changing patterns, I think we alter an old pattern or a preferred coordination pattern. We all have a preference, a way we like to do a motor skill, a preferred way of doing it. Whenever we try to change that pattern, there's what we call a transition period. And usually, if you've ever tried this, you're trying to learn a new technique on a skill maybe that you've already learned from a while back. Before you get better, you're going to get worse, right? We tend to resist change, and we continue to want to perform in the way that we've done in the past. There's that period of instability. We're actually doing worse. But eventually, if we hang in there, we will eventually adopt the new preferred pattern. So as we look at someone who has already learned a skill and we're trying to reteach them a skill, we need to recognize they are going to go through this type of scenario where it's going to get worse before it gets better. And again, I think this points out to the importance of teaching youngsters, and as we work with young people when they're first learning a skill, to do it correct the first time so we don't have to unteach a bad pattern of movement before they can improve their technique or their ability. So again, if we are trying to change an old pattern to a new pattern, remember that as coaches, as therapists, we need to provide a lot more positive reinforcement feedback during that transition period. A lot of support to get them to move from the old to the new, and recognizing there's that period of instability. The final way is dual task procedure, as we're trying to see if a motor skill has been acquired. We know that your attention demand decreases as you become more skillful. So as you look at the research, often what they'll do is a dual task procedure approach. They'll have a secondary task that they introduce to determine the level of learning of the primary task. So they add something that you have to do, and they do that in order to measure how well the primary task has been learned. There was a study they did with high school rugby players that showed that they had higher proficiency with the secondary tasks because they had less attention that was necessary for the primary task. So often in the research, you'll see them do that. They'll give secondary tasks that has to be performed, but they're really focusing on how well do they know the primary task. How well learned is that primary task? So that's called dual task procedure. As we finish up this chapter, we know that practice performance may actually misrepresent learning. Remember, learning is inferred as we watch practice trials. And there's two reasons for, there you go, two reasons. We know that a practice performance might actually overestimate or underestimate learning. They might do very, very well, but that doesn't mean that they've actually learned. It just might be a blip on the screen, or they might do very poorly, but actually learning is occurring. It's just not showing up. We often have what we call periods of practice plateaus. And again, if you're graphing this out, this would be a period that would level off. Performance would not see improvement, but it does not mean that learning is not taking place. It just means that for that point in time, the performance is not seeing that learning. So practice performance can either underestimate or actually overestimate what's actually happening in the learning process. When we talk about performance plateaus, we might ask the question, why do they occur? And we know that performance plateaus do occur. Again, they're performance plateaus. They are not learning plateaus. Often during a performance plateau, we still have learning taking place. It could be for a variety of reasons. They might be trying new strategies. They might have low motivation. They might be bored. They might just be tired. They might have low attention for a variety of reasons. And so when we consider these periods of time where we don't see a lot of improvement in performance, we need to encourage and recognize that learning can still be taking place, even though it's not being observed in the actual performance of the client or the athlete. Also, it can mean that it's just that period of transition that we talked about. So, in summary, quickly, look for improvement and consistency when practicing. Plot performance curves that will help you. And remember, performance is just inferring learning. It does not necessarily mean that learning is not happening. You're going to have plateaus, but learning has not stopped.